Last November, the Commission adopted Rule 365, known as the Critical Designation of Natural Gas Infrastructure. The intent of this rule was to address critical designation of natural gas infrastructure and/or sources. Put simply, in the event of a load shed like that we experienced in February of 2021, which natural gas providers are substantially contributing to the production of electrical power and therefore would need to stay on the grid to keep that gas supply available. That is the fundamental question before us. Since this Commission first started the implementation of Senate Bill 3, I've viewed our work as a balancing act. We must maximize gas supply in times of need while minimizing, to the greatest extent possible, the regulatory burden or any negative impact to our overall system. To ensure stability for those handful of days we experience inclement weather without negatively impacting oil and gas production that provide billions to the state coffers the other 360 or so days of the year. I spoke at length almost a year ago upon the adoption of 365 about the purpose and intent behind the rule, namely that those are significant contributors to the natural gas supply chain need to be designated as such to ensure stability of our natural gas system in times of energy emergencies. My feelings in that regard have not changed. What has changed since the adoption of 365 last year is that we have more information, more data, and better understanding from the oil and gas producers and the electrical power providers on how 365 could impact the production of our natural resources and the overall electrical grid in times of extreme demand. We now have more information than we first adopted to the rule. Based on the numerous public comments on our 366 weatherization rulemaking, I think it is right and proper to review Rule 365 in light of those facts. And as I stated last year, our goal for 365 is to focus on the high volume producers of natural gas to ensure they have the electricity available to operate and deliver their product to people's homes and for power generation. I mentioned three groups in that statement last year, The first group I referred to was supercritical. That is those who supply the overwhelming majority of our state's gas. The second was the very low producers, those who produce so little it makes no sense to keep their power on. The third was those in between. Those have modest production amounts but are mostly comprised of what we refer to as marginal wells. This last group I mentioned is unique for a couple of reasons. Number one, there are a lot of them. Number two, they do produce and contribute gas to the system, but the volume is significantly less than those in supercritical group. Number three, many of these assets are not owned and operated by large companies or major producers, but are comprised of many small operator, family-owned enterprises, and individuals that might have just a handful of employees. Larger operators have the manpower normally, regulatory compliance officers, and lawyers to ensure compliance. But I'm worried about the guy that might have a bunch of low-producing marginal wells and 2 to 3 employees having to navigate these new rules. At the end of the day, these small operators don't produce the volume of gas that is going to substantially impact gas production on the electrical grid. I'm not interested in issuing paperwork fines to the very people who make this state great. Again, I am interested and concerned with getting the most impact with the least amount of economic harm. I say economic harm for a few reasons. If some of these marginal wells are required to retrofit or add equipment for weatherization under Rules 365 or 66, the operator will make an economic decision such as, if I now have to spend money to retrofit a declining asset, does it make more sense to simply shut down production permanently? Maybe they just pack their bag, plug the well, and call it a day. What is the benefit of that? It means potential natural resources that could have a beneficial contribution to the Texas economy and global supply is now left in the ground. That is ultimately the opposite of what we should want, and I suspect the opposite of what the legislature intended when drafting SB 3. The flip side of this is what this means for electrical generators. When in a load shed situation, they want and need to have the flexibility to prioritize what is truly important. Here's an analogy that may help explain the issue. We want to make sure to get electricity to critical facilities like fire stations. Of course, those are important. But just because you have a fire extinguisher doesn't make you a fire station. Those are clearly different. And just because you have an extinguisher doesn't mean you should be considered critical and be given power in times of load shedding. After all, you may be able to put out one fire, but that's it. The more electricity we give to people with fire extinguishers instead of actual fire stations, the less electricity is available to power individual homes or facilities such as nursing homes. That's what I mean by a balancing act. Fire stations are supercritical. Fire extinguishers are those marginal wells. My focus, our focus at the Commission, and should be, is to ensure supercritical supply chain participants remain online and are able to continue operations. This includes about 16,500 leases, accounting for 23.4 BCF of gas per day, and importantly includes pipeline operators, gas processing facilities, and natural gas storage infrastructure. These leases and facilities are important to the supply chain and will be expected to deliver. This figure more than satisfies the demand generated on even our coldest days. Importantly, these figures do not account for the vast amount of gas storage available, which plays an important role in our ability to provide gas in peak demand periods. Texas underground gas storage alone can withdraw over 17 BCF of gas per day, nor does it include the existing gas within the pipeline system, which can be packed in advance to hold upwards of 30 BCF of gas. These efforts, combined with production from the supercritical group, will ensure ample gas will be available when needed, while limiting the overall economic and regulatory burden to the greatest extent possible. So I'm glad we are taking time to review this rule, and I look forward to receiving the public's input on these revisions to 365. Thank you, Haley.
Thank you, Commissioner. Chairman, you have any comments, thoughts?
No, thank you.
Okay. Haley, I've got one, and thank you all for I know you and Natalie and staff have taken hours upon hours. I know you've worked multiple weekends. I hope you take a break and see your kids in the next few weeks. But I've got a question just to understand. I know one of the things that staff has proposed on 365 or on 65 is to increase the floor, to put a floor on here. It'll remove some marginal wells, like Commissioner Wright has talked to. Can you tell me how much natural gas this will continue to apply to? Because we want to make sure, again, we have enough.
Yes, staff conducted those calculations using March production, and the facilities that are designated critical account for 78.4% of daily production.
Okay, so not everything's critical, but enough is still sitting there, so I appreciate it. And so we've put a floor of what, $250 for natural gas and $500 for oil, is that correct?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, great, thank you. Any other questions or comments?
Thank you for all your hard work.
We appreciate
This
it.
has been a big one.
And I appreciate y'all really paying attention to this and bringing back. I know we all felt like we did this in a backwards order, so it's helpful that we're continuing to make sure these rules are vibrant as we move forward. So, all right, I move that we approve the publication of these amendments to Rule 3.65 in the Texas Register. Is there a second?
Second.
Second by Commissioner Christian. All in favor say aye.
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 Motion passes. Thank you very much. And that item's approved, and we're going to 551.
Okay. Item 551 is staff's recommendation to adopt new Rule 16 Texas Administrative Code Section 3.66 relating to weather emergency preparedness standards. The new rule implements Sections 5, 6, 21, and 22 of Senate Bill 3. These sections amended the Natural Resources Code and Utilities Code to require the Commission to adopt rules regarding measures natural gas supply chain facility operators and pipeline operators must implement to prepare to operate during weather emergencies. Section 3.66 contains the weather emergency preparedness standards for both natural gas supply chain facilities and natural gas pipeline facilities. It also establishes a process for enforcement of violations and administration of penalties. On June 28th, the Commission approved the publication of the proposed rule, in the Texas Register for a public comment period, which ended on August 15th. The Commission received 139 comments on the proposal. Staff recommends the Commission adopt the rule with changes to the proposed text published in the July 15th issue of the Register. The recommended changes are described in the adoption preamble in your notebook materials. May I answer any questions?
Thank you. And Commissioner, we've got 3 people who want to make comments. Would you like to make yours first? I believe you have some, and I'm sure I've got some questions as well, or do you want to hear the people first?
Yeah, if you don't mind, let me go first.
Okay.
And we'll listen to them.
Yes, sir.
And again, take a deep seat. Both of these are very important to me, so some things I want to say. First, I want to thank the staff here at the Commission for their hard work on this rule and for their work over the past year to comply with the timeliness and statutory requirements of Senate Bill 3. I know it hasn't been any easy task. Today, we are considering, sure, Wayne, you didn't come up here earlier?
Stay down there. Just stay down there.
Today, we are considering the final portion of those requirements through the adoption of Rule 3.66, the Weather Emergency Preparedness Standards. I have reviewed the many comments and suggestions provided by the public that were submitted to the Commission since this rule was initially proposed. I read with interest several of the public comments which chastised this rule because it does not prohibit operators from shutting down production prior to a weather event. And indeed, as I stated in my comments when this Commission passed 365 last November, this is my quote, "The Railroad Commission has no authority to require operators to produce gas at a specific time, or for that matter at all. The oil and gas industry is no different than any other business in this regard. So it is important to remember what the purpose behind this weatherization rule is and what it isn't. The oil and gas industry is not homogeneous. It is comprised of many unique and individual parts that, working in concert, provide us with the many creature comforts we enjoy in our daily lives. That includes upstream, which is comprised of oil wells, gas wells, gathering pipelines, and it includes midstream, which are processing plants, compressor stations, transmission pipelines, and saltwater disposal facilities. These are all unique. They all have their individual functions, needs, challenges, and vulnerabilities as it concerns their operations. It is impossible to write rules or legislation to remove all risk or mandate normal operations, to envision every conceivable weather event and how it might impact the various parts of our system is not feasible. But what we can do is ask those entities to look at their operations, identify potential vulnerabilities, and have plans and procedures to fortify their operations to avoid or minimize disruptions. This rule is about preparation. It's about planning for the unknown. It's about communicating. It's about ensuring that those identified as a critical piece of our natural gas supply system can continue to do so when they are most needed. I've read some comments who express concerns that some may just want to pay the fine to avoid weatherizing at all. I don't believe that would occur for the simple fact that the classification schedule places serious emphasis on operator conduct, repeat violations, and efforts taken by operators to remedy violations. Repeat and deliberate attempts to avoid compliance with 3.66 will not be taken lightly by the Commission, and it will result in referral to the Attorney General. I've also read some recent media stories that have stated our proposed rule opens the door to market manipulation. I feel such arguments exemplify a total lack of understanding regarding the oil and natural gas supply chain and a fundamental misrepresentation of how these commodities are retrieved from a mile or more under the ground and are ultimately delivered to the end user. Let me give you a brief explanation of why this is unlikely the case. If you operate an oil well, that is a well that produces primarily oil along with a modest amount of gas referred to as casing head gas, you profit primarily from selling oil. The gas is not the primary source of your expected revenue. Then there is also purely gas wells. Combined, these sectors are collectively known as upstream. So you have a well producing primary oil along with some natural gas. Now you have to do something with that natural gas, and ideally you don't just waste that resource. I, like many in this room and in this state, am not a fan of wasting our precious natural resources. Because you are a responsible operator, you want to minimize flaring and ideally would like to make some money from the gas you produce from your oil well. So instead, you connect to a pipeline who agrees to take that gas off your hands. The pipeline purchases your gas at the point of connection to their system. The pipeline company is what we refer to as midstream. As a producer of this gas, remember, you own an oil well and such are primarily concerned with liquids. You agree to sell your gas to the pipeline or midstream at a predetermined price, which is usually negotiated at the beginning of the month. So there is zero incentive for you to shut in a well for purposes of raising prices in times of inclement weather. I agree with the inherent objective of SB3 as it relates to securing our natural gas supply chain, and know my fellow commissioners in the industry does as well. I have heard the stories of struggles that many in our state faced without power over the course of Winter Storm Uri, and I myself was not exempt from those hardships. Like everyone else, I don't want to experience that again. However, the legislative approach used by SB3 as it relates to matters under the Commission's jurisdiction was, at least in my opinion, like using a shotgun when a .22 would have sufficed. Because the reality is, the further down the supply chain you go, the more variables exist, and more variables equal more uncertainty. At the end of the day, the best way to ensure greater reliability is to reduce the number of things that can go wrong, and that means reducing the number of variables that you must contend with. There seems to be an obsession, or at the very least, an overemphasis on production from the wellhead. While it is certainly an important component in the overall system, our electrical grid shouldn't be overly reliant on just daily production to keep the power on. That isn't the case for many states or countries who are not blessed with the same significant natural resources as Texas. I'll close this by saying we should be focused on preparation. The best way Texas can prepare for the unexpected is to plan in advance. That means incentivizing and increasing the amount of availability of processed dry natural gas in our storage reserves. Texas has approximately 550 BCF of total gas storage capacity and is currently utilizing around 60% of that capacity space. As summer demand recedes and Texas begins preparing for the winter season, critical infrastructure facilities such as electrical power generators should take full advantage of the state's available underground gas storage capacity to plan and prepare for the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Mr. Chairman, you have anything?
No, I appreciate his remarks and appreciate the good work our staff has done.
Thank you. Thank you, Haley, again, you and Natalie, and I appreciate the 139 comments. I probably wasn't as much in the weeds, but I read them all, and I appreciate the feedback we've got from people all over. I've got a couple of questions just to clarify maybe some of the changes that you looked at and some of the comments. Can you explain what the comments were and how you changed the attestation section? Is it similar kind of what we do to other rules? Would that be a fair assessment of it?
Yes, that's correct. We had a number of comments that said that it was a departure from commission practice, and so we tried to align it more with traditional commission forms. Most likely, or the closest one is the P5 organization report. That's where we borrowed the language from.
Okay, great. And can you talk about some of the statutory requirements, both penalties, enforcement, preparation, things like that were mandated by SB3, and confirm that this rule complies with that as well? Can you kind of go through a couple of the high points again, please?
Yes. Senate Bill 3 requires that operators that are subject to its requirements implement measures to prepare to operate during a weather emergency. So you'll see a lot of those terms in the rule language and then throughout the preamble, just to drive the point home that we borrowed those terms from SB 3. As far as enforcement, the two statutes that authorize the commission to have enforcement authority over violations of this rule are different. So there's a statute for gas supply chain facilities, and there's one that relates to gas pipeline facilities. The commission will be handling both the enforcement and administration of violations for both types of facilities, so determining whether a violation occurs. But for gas supply chain facilities, the statute is different, and it doesn't authorize the commission to assess the penalty. So for gas supply chain facilities, the commission will be referring those to the Attorney General, like you said, Commissioner Wright. But in both cases, the statutes authorize a penalty of $1 million for a violation.
Okay,
Does
and
that
we'll
answer
do,
your question?
yes, ma'am, and we'll be doing inspections on all of this as well.
Correct. Those will begin December 1st.
Okay. And my last question, we had a lot of comments about the list that we had, all the requirements on weatherization, and I believe in our final draft, we've taken the list out and we hope to put some guidelines in. Is that correct? Can you explain that?
Yes, we had a lot of comments that recommended, instead of putting the weatherization practices in the rule, that we take them out of the rule and put them into a published document so that we can continue to engage with operators to determine what the different weatherization practices are, and then be able to update that more frequently than if we had them in the rule. So in the adopted version, we've removed that list from the rule, and we plan to publish guidance on our website about those weatherization practices.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for answering my
Thank you.
questions. I appreciate that. I appreciate all your work. We do have, I'm going to bring up the 3 people who've asked to make comments, and then we'll bring you back up. All right, number 1 is Luke Warford, please. And everybody, I'm going to give you about like